it's me. Welcome to my channel. Today we are transported back to 15th century England for the Wars of the Roses. Join us. Imagine being the king's son, next in line to the throne of England. You live in a magnificent palace, have all the luxuries that money can buy, and everyone respects you. You are destined for greatness. That is until your uncle murders your father and takes the crown for himself. That's what happened to two young princes, the sons of King Edward IV, when their uncle, the infamous Richard III, seized power in 1483. What happened to the princes after that? Well, they vanished without a trace, only to be seen again centuries later in the form of bones found in a London parking lot. And whether they died in the Tower of London or escaped and lived out the rest of their lives in secret, well, that is still debated today. So let's rewind the clock to understand how these boys came to be the most famous missing persons in British history. The story begins with the Wars of the Roses, so named because each of the two royal houses whose members fought for the throne used a different rose as their emblem. The House of York's rose was white and the House of Lancaster's was red. The wars began in 1455 and lasted for the next 32 years. There were numerous battles during this time, but the most important to our story was the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471. At that battle, the Lancastrian army was defeated and their young leader, a boy of only 16, was killed. This effectively ended the reign of the House of Lancaster. The new king, Edward IV, was from the House of York. He would rule until 1483. Edward had 3 sons with his wife Elizabeth Woodville, making them heirs to the throne. The eldest was Edward, born in 1470 and created Prince of Wales. Then came Richard, born in 1472 and made Duke of York. Finally, there was John, born in 1476 and given the title Duke of Somerset. But the boys weren't exactly legitimate, and their existence was actually a problem for their dad, the king. You see, Edward IV didn't really want to marry Elizabeth Woodville. She was just a commoner after all. But his counselors convinced him that he had no choice. They said the marriage was a sham and that he could easily get rid of her. But once she gave birth to his first son, the public loved the family so much that this was no longer an option. In fact, the popularity of the Woodville family was getting to be a little too much for the king. Elizabeth had also become very wealthy since the death of her husband, Sir John Grey, who died in the Battle of Tewkesbury, which left her with a fortune and 5 sisters. These sisters then married into powerful noble families. All this made Edward a bit nervous. He had taken the throne with the help of his friend, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and other powerful men known as the magnates. Now those same magnates were throwing their weight around, supporting the Woodvilles, and it was making the king feel a bit uneasy. He may have even been jealous of Elizabeth's popularity. Whatever the reason, in 1477, Edward decided to kick them all out of his court, including the Woodville family. But this didn't last long. Within 2 years, he had forgiven them and brought them back to court, giving Elizabeth's brother a noble title and setting up her nephew as a courtier. However, it wouldn't be smooth sailing from there. As Edward got older, he became increasingly erratic and cruel, even executing people for minor crimes. In 1483, he went a step further. The exact circumstances surrounding this event are unknown, but it seems that Edward had some kind of psychotic break and murdered 4 courtiers after accusing them of plotting against him. Then he did something that shocked everyone. He agreed to marry one of his daughters to the son of his old friend and ally, the Earl of Salisbury, cementing this powerful family's hold on the throne. It goes without saying that this snub of a lifetime did not sit well with the magnates. They were furious and began plotting with the Woodville family. Together, they hatched a plan to depose the king and install his eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales, in his place. Now, if you're thinking this sounds eerily similar to another famous story about kings and sons being murdered by their own fathers, well, you're not alone. Historians do too. This is believed to be where the legend of King Lear from Shakespeare comes from. However, before anyone could take action, Edward IV died suddenly of the sweating sickness, leaving the throne to his 12-year-old son and making his widow and daughters wards of the state. You know, the whole point of the original plot was to put Edward, Prince of Wales, on the throne, but now that he was king, that wasn't necessary. In fact, it could be dangerous. After all, what would happen when Edward grew up and wanted to marry his beloved Anne Neville? His mother would always come between them. So it's no surprise that the Woodville family and magnates tried to get rid of her and her daughters. However, the Queen Mother and her family were saved by the one person you wouldn't expect, the new king's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was a popular member of the royal court, despite the fact that he had scoliosis so bad that he was nicknamed Richard Crookback. However, Richard's loyalty was to the crown, not his family. He saw an opportunity to advance his own power and took it. First, he had the young king's counselors removed, replacing them with his own men. Then he set his sights on the Woodvilles. On April 26, 1483, he had them arrested, accused them of treason and murdered them, along with any allies he suspected were loyal to the Woodvilles. But Richard didn't stop there. He then marched on the Tower of London, where the young Edward and his two younger brothers were living under the protection of their mother's family. Richard seized the boys and took them inside the tower. There he charged them with treason, based on the false claim that their mother had married one of the men he had just executed. Then he locked them up, never to be seen again. Richard went on to seize the throne for himself, starting his reign by calling for anyone who knew what had happened to the princes to come forward with their story. No one did. A few weeks later, he commissioned a series of paintings depicting his coronation, but notably excluding the younger princes. Was this all a coincidence, or did Richard know something we don't? Richard's reign would only last 2 years. In 1485, he faced off against the forces of Henry Tudor, the last surviving son of Edward IV's sister, at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard died in battle, making Henry the first Tudor king and ending the Wars of the Roses. But the mystery of what happened to the two young princes remained. Over the years, many stories emerged. Some claimed the princes were strangled in the tower, while others said they were thrown into the Thames River. One even claimed they had escaped and were living somewhere in Europe. Then in 1674, 2 boys were discovered in the grounds of a parking lot near the tower. When excavation revealed a skeleton in the foundations of an old wall, speculation ran rampant that the princes' remains had finally been found. The skeletons were given to the physician and scientist Edmund Custis, who examined them and determined that one of the bodies was that of a young boy. Further investigation showed that the bones belonged to a male and female, and that they were likely around 12 and 9 years old when they died. The consensus was that they had been deliberately killed and buried together, but no one was sure why. Could this be the missing princes? Maybe. In 1931, the bones were transferred to the Tower of London, where they remain to this day. Another analysis of the bones conducted in 1933 concluded that the 2 bodies were indeed male and around 12 and 9 years old when they died. But that was as far as the investigation went until 2012, when the remains were reanalyzed once more. Researchers used a variety of methods to examine the bones, including DNA analysis, histology, and isotope analysis. DNA testing revealed that the 2 boys were indeed related, but not in the way historians thought. Their relationship was more like uncle and nephew than father and son, and the results suggested that the princes were likely killed by someone within their own family. So does this mean that the princes in the tower were not who we think they were? Not necessarily. The bones could belong to the sons of Edward IV, but to another man in the royal court who was about the same age as Richard, Duke of York. Remember, Richard was only 10 years older than his supposed victim. Unfortunately, we don't have enough evidence to say for sure. And the mystery of what happened to the princes in the tower continues. What do you think happened to the princes in the tower? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this one.